And I am so excited to have with me here today attorney Aaron Thomas of prenups.com. And I'm going to let him introduce himself in just a moment. But before I do, I wanted to just let everybody know like why we're having this conversation. I know that some people are probably like, why is Veronica having a conversation about prenups? I thought that she was all about estate planning and heirs property. And the reason why is because estate planning and heirs property deals with property. And when you marry somebody, then your property is going to become intertwined unless you do some things. And so I had an opportunity to meet Attorney Thomas a few months ago via Zoom. We had a Zoom check in. I had a couple of clients who reached out to me for estate planning and they were about to get married. And so they wanted to make sure that they could protect their assets, not protect their assets, but they wanted to make sure that their assets were kept separate from their future spouses for various reasons that we can talk about in a few minutes. But I asked someone who knows about prenups, and a lot of people told me about Attorney Thomas, Aaron Thomas, and so we talked and I was like, I want to have my people hear from you because I think that you have a perspective on prenups that a lot of people need to hear. So that's why we're here today. And thank you again, Aaron, Attorney Thomas. And I'll give you a chance to just introduce yourself and how you got into focusing on prenups.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you first, Veronica, for having me here. It's an honor to speak to you and to speak to your listeners, your audience. My name is Aaron Thomas. I am a practicing attorney. I've been practicing in the state of Georgia for 22 years now, most of that time in family law. I had my own firm, Aaron Thomas Law, where I practiced divorce, custody, child support, all of the things associated with family law, including prenuptial and postnuptial agreements. And over the past several years, I've developed a specialty in prenups and postnups, and I founded prenups.com in 2022.
Okay. Well, awesome. Well, so you have a book that is behind you, and I also have a copy here. I have started reading it, and it's really good. It's not like a boring lawyer book that you might expect from a lawyer. It's pink, which shows a little fun and a little bit of just a different perspective, and it's written so well. So I just want to make sure everybody knows about the book here. We'll talk a little bit more about it later. And I'm gonna just start out first, with a question about prenups. What is a prenup? Because I think that that's the first thing people need to know in order for them to really get into this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for asking that up front because it is such a misunderstood topic. A prenup, I describe a prenup as a set of rules that defines your financial relationship with your spouse, both during and after marriage. And you can see that I emphasize the word during there because one of the first of many misconceptions about prenups is that all they are is a plan for your divorce. You're writing out your divorce decree before you even get started, which nobody wants to do. It's unromantic, it's all of those things. But I think that a prenup should be looked more like a partnership agreement for your marriage. And we can talk about kind of the details of why in a moment. But the reason that I described it as a set of rules or a set of laws that govern your financial relationship with your spouse is because um, everybody, when you think about it that way, every married couple has a prenup. You either have your own written rules that you have put into a contract yourself, or you are accepting the laws of the state where you happen to live. And it is my observation. So, you're entering into a contract when you get married that deals with your finances either way. And it's my observation that if people were facing the choice of signing their own prenup that they sat down with their partner and developed, or the state prenup, virtually nobody would sign the default prenup or the state prenup because it gives the power over the distribution of your life savings to a complete stranger, to a judge who will be sitting on a bench, who may have a few hours to listen to, you and your spouse, versus writing your own prenup, which means that you and your spouse decide uh, what is yours, what is theirs, and what is ours. At a high level, a prenup is going to define what's mine, what's yours, and what's ours, as well as it can govern a whole lot of other things in terms of how you manage your finances during the marriage itself.
I thank you for explaining that. And I want to give you a heads up that we talked that we kind of talked through some of the questions, but as you were speaking it, I had a question. So if this is like way off of what you with your level of expertise, just let me know, or not level, but your scope. So you I want to help everybody to know that prenups, like you said, they deal with during marriage and after marriage, if that is the case. And I wanted to see, are there any things legally during a marriage that state law controls that you can actually change with your prenup? So, like, kind of helping people to see that there might be things, if there are things that legally, even while you're married, there might be some laws that impact how your property is handled, versus having a prenup, and how you can even dictate those kind of legal things during your marriage. That makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I look at a prenup in terms of, before marriage, during marriage, and after marriage, in terms of, what kinds of things can it cover. And state laws, the state prenup, one of the reasons why a lot of people don't realize that they have kind of a default prenup is because those rules really only come into play when you're going through a divorce. So, I'll give you a couple examples. So if you are signing your own prenup, one of the rules, and this is in all 50 states, for your prenup to be enforceable is both spouses have to disclose all of their assets and debts. Usually we do this in writing. We literally prepare a net worth statement for each spouse and attach it to the back of the agreement. And so there has to be full disclosure on, what your finances look like coming into the relationship. Uh, I think that it would be a good rule for any couple who gets married to have to disclose all their assets and debts coming into the relationship, because a lot of times people find out that their spouse owes money to the IRS only when they file joint taxes and their refund gets garnished by the IRS, or they find out a couple years into the relationship that their spouse has 20 grand of credit card debt, or that they have bad credit and they only find that out when they're applying for a loan together, or those kinds of things. And it's not hard to see why some of those issues cause real problems in people's relationships while they're married. Another example is, and there are many in terms of like managing your finances during the relationship itself. We will often write in a rule where you have an ongoing duty to disclose any kind of finances. And so it's very common in the prenups that we draft to have a rule where the couple is to sit down once a year and they update each other on their financial disclosures. What are the changes in your income, in your debts, in the assets that you have in your name, and that way there's kind of this ongoing transparency during the relationship itself. You can also say how the money is going to flow during your relationship. So if you don't have a prenup, what often happens is, people continue to keep their money separate, or sometimes they put everything in one joint bank account, but there's not kind of a structured way of how you're going to manage your finances during the relationship. We will often put into a prenuptial agreement rules about, okay, are you going to do what I call the inside out plan, where all of your income goes directly into a joint account, and then you each get kind of spending money that flows out into your separate accounts from there? Or are you going to do what I call the outside in plan, where money flows, your paychecks continue to go into your separate accounts, but then you fund a joint account in some kind of agreed upon proportion. And that is what's used to pay the joint expenses. And solving that issue, figuring out, like, how is the money going to flow, who has access to what money, or even like spending rules. It's very common. I have it in my own prenup that if we're going to spend over $500 from a joint account, me and my wife have to check with each other first. And just that one rule can save, some of the arguments that often come up about spending in relationships. So, yeah, there's a number of things you can do that govern, how you manage your finances during the marriage itself. The state laws really don't say anything about that. You can keep all your finances secret from your spouse with no penalty. You can hide debts from your spouse. You can hide assets from your spouse, and there's really nothing you can do about it, because the state laws only come into play when you're going through a divorce.
I think that is like so powerful. That was one thing when I was reading the book. I just thought, like, how many people enter a marriage just not even thinking about all the things that your future spouse may have done financially. Some of it may have been like bad stuff that they did, but a lot of it was probably just innocent mistakes or just things that they did that they didn't know that other people don't do. I know that was something that with me and my husband, with us getting married, we realized that we come from two different perspectives when it comes to money. And a lot of times you don't really notice it until you're in the thick of it and you're dealing with particular decisions that have to be made. And I love how with this approach to doing prenups, you are I won't say encouraged, you are almost forced to have a very transparent conversation. You're legally required to have a very transparent conversation that otherwise we're just not legally required to do. In preparing for this, just I was just thinking a lot about how marriage is so much about legal and financial partnership. It's in a way that the average person doesn't think about because we're just thinking, oh well, we're one and we're doing our things together. And you might have different definitions of what that means, or you may not really understand what this half of the one is bringing to the table versus what you're bringing. So I just really love the fact that you're highlighting these issues, and I kind of got ahead of us a little bit when with some of my questions, but I wanted to see if you could kind of take us back and define um, what you call a prescribed prenup versus a traditional prenup. Because I saw in your book that you're saying one, consider a prenup, but two, you might want to consider a different kind of prenup. So I wanted to see if you could kind of highlight that for us in this conversation.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think I have to comment on what you said because I think it's such a great point that we get married for love. We're not getting married for the financial and legal obligations that come along with it. And we realize that, oh wait, this is a financial partnership. This is a legal partnership, and after we're already in it. But yeah, in terms of a traditional prenup. Is probably what most people think of when they hear a prenup. It's that you're just mostly protecting premarital assets. You're saying that these things that I'm bringing in are mine, whether they're debts or assets. And, if there's a divorce that, I keep these things. But to me, that kind of addresses, what you have coming in and what happens at the end. And the real magic is what happens during the marriage. Before I started practicing family law, I also didn't know that you could put anything in a prenup about what is happening during the marriage itself. But when you think about it, it really makes sense. If your prenup says, all right, if we get divorced, I keep all the accounts in my name, you keep the accounts in your name, and we split anything, in the joint accounts 50-50. And most people say, okay, yeah, that sounds fine. But that's a very different contract depending on where your paycheck gets deposited. Right. So, if I'm putting my paycheck in the joint account and we're splitting that 50-50 and you're putting your paycheck in a separate account, that's very different. So you really can't make this decision about how you're going to divide up accounts at the end of the marriage without addressing what you are going to do during the marriage itself. And so once I realized that you could address topics during the marriage, I kind of doubled down on it, and really this was, a lot of this was in preparation for my own marriage. I was getting married, and as a divorce lawyer, the last thing that I wanted to do was set myself up for failure or run into some of the same pitfalls that I saw my clients come into over the years. And so my wife, who was also a lawyer, and had been through a divorce herself, we really were hyper vigilant about like kind of protecting both of us from coming into the relationship with assumptions that if we weren't aligned, can really break apart a marriage, break apart a relationship. Everybody knows that one of the top things, if not the top thing, that couples argue about is money. And so we wanted to be, very intentional about what we put into our prenup. So the prescribed prenup includes, how are you going to set up your bank accounts? How is the money going to flow during your relationship? And in the book, we talk about instituting something called an annual shareholders meeting in your relationship. I do a lot of analogies to businesses, and I'll talk about why in just a second, where we sit down once a year and we've got to talk through a certain list of things, um, income, assets, debts. Were there any big surprises from last year's spending? Are there big things happening this upcoming year that we want to plan for? Travel? Is this the year that we have a baby or buy a new house or try to get a rental property, or move to a different location, or someone changes jobs? And make it intentional where we talk about some of these financial issues that otherwise you can go years or sometimes even an entire marriage without ever really addressing these things because they're kind of uncomfortable, right? It's taboo to talk about money. And, it's not the sexiest topic in the world, especially when you're dating, you're trying to put your best foot forward. You don't go out on a first date and lay out your net worth statement on the table. It's not exactly first date material, but then it turns out it's not third date material either. It's not 10th date material. And then all of a sudden you're getting married and you don't know your spouse's credit score. You don't know like what kind of debt they're bringing in. And because marriage is this true financial partnership, you can, if your marriage doesn't work out, you can be held responsible for your spouse's debts that you didn't even know about, right? Your spouse's finances are going to impact you up and down, even if you never get divorced. Your spouse's finances are going to impact when can you retire, what kind of house can you buy, what kind of credit can you apply for. And so, I look at a business partnership, and if you were merging your business with another person's business, what kind of information would you want? You would want to know every detail about how that person's business runs, about the finances, how much debt do you have? Do you pay off your debt on a monthly basis? Are you carrying, debt and paying a lot of interest? You would want to know every detail before you merge your business with another business. But somehow in our personal relationships, we sometimes think it's okay to skip over that step. And we would never do that in a business setting. We would want to have all of those details about how is this thing going to run. And I am just of the strong belief that your marriage is the most important relationship that you're going to have, and it deserves the same kind of respect and thoughtfulness and care going into it that you would any kind of business venture.
Yeah, that is so powerful. It's so powerful. And as a business owner, I realized this a little bit more, even just as a business owner being married. Anytime I need anything related to finance, and they want to know what my husband's finances look like. And I'm just like, this is for my business. And they're like, we want to have him to participate in this. We want to have all of his assets. We want to have all of his financials, and we want him to sign off on this. Because at the point where I'm at my business, I'm not at a place where they just look strictly at my business. They want to know what's my spouse doing. And that's something that was kind of surprising to me, that every time I wanted to do anything financially for my business, I have to, get my husband to participate. And it's the same way. Now, I point that out for him, it's the same thing, because back in the day, it wasn't like that. Back in the day, for the woman, she had to get permission and get everything from her husband, get him to sign off, but he didn't have to do the same. But thankfully, it's a little more equal these days.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's totally right. I mean, you look at the history of marriage in this country, and we think about marriage of, oh, it's two people becoming one, and it's this union, and it has this very, like kind of like romantic feel to it. But historically, the two people becoming one meant the woman ceased to exist as a legal entity. Married women couldn't own assets in their own name, and men were seen as kind of like the head and master of the household. I mean, that was on the books in Louisiana law until the 1980s. When they finally said, no, if you're going to take out a second mortgage on a house, that's in both parties' names, you have to let your wife know. I mean, so this idea of two people becoming one was really built on 1920s, 1930s, when women couldn't work, there was only one income in the household. And in today's day and age, both spouses working is the norm. Women are in the workforce in higher proportions than they have ever been. And so it's not as simple as, and one of the examples I give is, the 1960s. What was the 1960s marriage like compared to today? My parents got married in the 1960s. And back then, the average age of people getting married was 21. And each spouse, student loans weren't anything like they are today. Credit cards barely existed. 401ks hadn't been invented yet. The couple there wasn't online banking. The couple got married in the 1960s. They were likely to have one bank account between the two of them, maybe one car between the two of them. They had no business. They had no retirement. Minimum student loans were at a minimum. Credit cards barely existed. They had no real property, no home. And you compare that to a couple getting married today, and the average age of a first marriage today is 30. And that couple is likely to have 4 or 5 bank accounts each, 3 or 4 credit cards each, 1 or 2 retirement accounts each. They've each got their own car. One spouse is likely to have some equity in a house or a condo. One spouse is likely to have some stake in a small business or shares in a large business. Investment accounts, student loans can be in the 10s, sometimes 6 figures of student loans.
Yes.
And so, the couple getting married in the 1960s, they're a startup. They're starting from absolute scratch together. They build everything that they have financially together. The couple getting married today, it's like a corporate merger. And maybe more important than all of those, assets and debts that they have is the couple getting married today. They've each got their own financial habits that they've built up over a decade since they moved out of their parents' house. And sometimes that's more tricky to merge together. The different save, one's a spender, one's a saver. They got different investment strategies. That's more difficult to combine than just, the assets and the debts. And so the idea that you can just open up a joint bank account and expect that things are going to work smoothly, it's a little scary. And that's why you see so many financial problems in married couples today. And one of the reasons why I'm such a big proponent of people having a prenup and really coming in and defining what their roles and responsibilities are going to be in their financial relationship with their spouse.
Yeah, I we have about 35 more minutes, and I can't even imagine how we could cover the rest of the information in a part two. We're not gonna get it here today, so I'm gonna try my best to get some questions related to estate planning and heirs property because this is just some really good stuff. But before I get to some of the how this relates to estate planning and heirs property, I wanted to ask you, with prenups, is it something that you should have a certain amount of money before you actually consider this? Or like if you don't have a lot and you're about to get married, do you think that couples still should consider getting a prenup?
Yes, I think that prenups are for every couple. I mean, if you ask me, does a couple need a prenup? I think, does a couple need a partnership plan? Does a couple need a plan for how they're going to manage their money? And should a couple be clear on what's mine, what's yours, and what's ours? And I don't think that relates just to wealthy people. I mean, that's one of the misconceptions about prenups, is that they're just for, the rich people. And if you look as a prenup, even if you're looking at it just as preparation for, hopefully taking the possibility of a messy divorce off the table. If you just look at it as divorce insurance and not even consider all the things that happen during the marriage, it's still worth it, because what makes divorces messy, and I say this as somebody who has litigated pieces of 1,000 divorces over the past 20 years. If what makes a divorce messy is rarely just, fights over what each spouse had coming in. It's fights about what people accumulated during the relationship itself. Should I have to share my retirement with my spouse? Or what about this house that I bought in my name only and I paid the mortgage every single month? Those are the disputes that really make divorces messy and expensive. And if you're wealthy, you can afford to pay lawyers 3, 4, 5 grand a month for a year and a half long divorce case. but it's really the middle class couples that get hurt the most when they go through a divorce and they don't have a prenup because they've got enough that they need to protect. If you've got 100 grand in equity in a house and you got 150 grand in your retirement, that is absolutely plenty to fight for. If you've been married 10, 15, 20 years and you built up these assets, you need that. But you also at the same time can't afford to pay 50 grand to take your divorce case to trial if your spouse doesn't agree on how things should be divided. And so those are the couples I think that are maybe most in need of a prenup. As well as business owners, and we can go on down the line, but certainly it's more about, I think, are you on an upward trajectory? Are you going to accumulate assets in the six figures over the course of your relationship? If you're 20 and you're probably going to be living check to check and you're going to have nothing until you're 65, okay, but that's not most of the people. Anyone who's tuning into this doesn't fit in that category, right? If you're going to accumulate assets, then um, yes, you need to have a clear partnership plan about what's mine, what's yours, what's ours. And it's a lot easier to decide that on the front end of a relationship when you love each other and the communication and respect are high than to try to make that agreement when the communication is broken down and you can't stand each other. So yes, I think the prenups are, pretty much for every couple. And even if you don't, it is at least worth having the conversation, to make sure that you're on the same page in terms of, who's responsible for these debts, who owns these assets, are our retirement accounts shared or are they separate? And, these are important questions for every couple to ask.
That's so true. It's so true. And so with that being said, we have the conversation before marriage, that would be ideal. But for those who are married, is there any way that some of these principles can be implemented for a currently married couple, or can they get a prenup or something like it?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So we call it a postnup, So I mean, they're in most states, a prenup and a postnup are the exact same thing. They cover the exact same issues. It's just that a prenup is signed prior to the date of marriage and a postnup is signed after the date of marriage. And there's a lot of reasons that people will get a postnup. Some people they kind of meant to do a prenup and wedding planning, wedding season got away from them and they didn't get around to it and they come back and they want to do it after their marriage. There are some couples who they realize that, the what I call the default prenup basically throws everything you have into one bucket, 1 hour's bucket. But there are a lot of couples who they live their lives like, this is mine, that's yours, and this is ours. You may have, the house is ours, but this is my car, that's your car. This is my retirement, that's your retirement. And often I'll have couples where, one spouse is very, very diligent about saving for the retirement, and the other is, not really saving for retirement, but they're putting their money into a business. And both of them kind of agree that, okay, your retirement is your retirement and my business is my business, but let's just put that in writing, so that it's legally enforceable. Because people who live these kind of informal agreements of, this is mine, that's yours, they go through a divorce and they realize the court isn't going to respect these informal boundaries that we have drawn. The court doesn't care whose name is on a retirement account or whose name is on a checking or a savings account. If money was accumulated into these assets during the marriage, that's marital property that's up for division. And so 50% of my job as a divorce lawyer was having this exact conversation with couples where they say, what do you mean she wants half of my retirement when I'm the one who saved retirement during the marriage and she didn't put money away? What do you mean he wants half of the house that I paid the mortgage for every month during the marriage? He didn't contribute to it. And I'd have to explain to them that the way that you had it titled or who put whose paycheck into it doesn't really matter, because your paycheck during the marriage is considered marital property. So anything you buy with it is considered joint from the court's perspective. And so if you have these boundaries in your mind, you need to put them down on paper. And that forces the court to respect those boundaries rather than just have this kind of informal understanding of, mine, yours, and ours.
That's a really good point. So it brings two lawyer questions to my mind. One lawyer question is about modification. We started out, we thought that these rules were good ideas. There's one situation I think about in terms of maybe debt. Like initially you got married, you thought we want to have a very limited approach, a very I guess conservative approach to debt. then perhaps as the marriage continues, you realize that there might be opportunities that you will miss out on if you don't raise the bar in the sense of your approach to debt and what's allowed. So are there ways that a prenup, postnup could be modified during the marriage?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can modify, typically with a prenup, you're going to write a postnup. You'll include all the provisions that you want to carry over and write any new provisions into it. Or if you have a postnup, you can come back and revise it, as many times as you want to, as many times as both you and your spouse agree. And just like you said, I mean, great point. There are, circumstances where, one spouse may be starting a business, and maybe up until that point, the couple was 50-50 on everything, but one person's starting a business, and they want that business to remain them, but they also may want to shield their spouse from the debt of the business and say, okay, if anything ever happens with this business, or anything happens in our relationship, I'm going to be responsible for the debt. But if we break up, I'm also going to keep the business. It's going to be, my project. Or the other spouse may say, hey, I'm going to get this rental property, and I'm going in 50-50 with my sister on this rental property. But this is just going to be our little project here on the side. If that couple gets divorced, the court isn't going to respect it. And so this property that you own with somebody else can get pulled into the divorce case, or the business partnership that you have with a third party can get pulled into the divorce case. And that creates, some of the messiest situations you can ever imagine when you start talking about third parties who, they didn't sign up to be partners with your spouse. They signed up to be partners with you. And so, people starting a business, or people, going into some kind of joint venture with a third party, or they just want to clarify, what's mine, what's yours, and what's ours, and get clear about those things. And then there are some couples who they do a postnup because uh, they had some crisis in the relationship, and maybe there's a spouse who, I left my job to raise our children and to be a homemaker, or I've made sacrifices in my career. And, now I find out that, you've stepped out on the relationship, and I want to put in place, that I'm going to get 50% of the assets if we split up. And maybe we want to work on the relationship, we want to make it work, but I need some guarantees that I'm going to be financially protected. Because if I've left my job for 10, 15 years, and now I'm looking at the possibility of having to go out and start a second career in my 40s or 50s, I want to make sure that, if something happens to our relationship, that there's going to be, some alimony provided for me, that I'm going to get my fair share of the assets. In 41 out of the 50 states in the US, a court doesn't have to split all of your assets 50-50. The court can do it 60-40 or 70-30 based on that judge's subjective opinion of each spouse's contributions to the marriage. And that's both financial and non-financial contributions. And so you can get in front of a judge. Judges are just, as well, judges are just humans like anybody else. They come in with their own biases and their own, conceptions. And so you can have one judge that says, well, if you earn most of the money, you get to keep most of the money. And you can have another judge that says, no, no, no. If both of you are in this relationship, I'm 50-50 on everything. This means that, couples can have the power to decide what that is on their own. And if you just want 50-50 and you want to lock in 50-50, no questions asked on everything that you actually have to put that in a prenup to get that enforced, because otherwise you can end up in front of a judge who's like, I'm going to split this 2/3, 1/3, or 75-25 based on the way that I look at the situation. And so, that's one of the other, misconceptions people have about prenups, is that they're only used to entrench financial inequality, to keep the rich spouse rich and the poor spouse poor. And very often it's just the opposite. It's like, hey, if we're going to be 50-50 on this, let's put it in writing, so we don't get in a situation where, we're at the end of a relationship and we're hurt. And now both of us have an incentive to sling mud at each other and try to throw any, try to tear down the other person in a courtroom to see if it convinces the judge to give us the majority of the assets that we built up. So, it can be used for those purposes as well.
Yeah, I think as attorneys we know how the courts work, how the laws work, how judges work to an extent. Sometimes you just don't know how they're gonna do. But one thing that I think about, and also want to point out that a lot of this is gonna be more aligned to Georgia law versus some other states who might have totally different approaches. But as far as Georgia law, it's my understanding that there's an equitable division of property, not equal. And so I think sometimes people think equitable and equal means the same thing, but equitable allows you to make it less equal so that you consider fairness factors. Is that kind of how it works?
That is exactly right. Yes, Georgia is one of 41 equitable division states, and that's exactly how it's treated. Is the court is going to decide what is fair, and it does not necessarily mean 50-50. Sometimes it is 50-50, but very often it's not. And there's like in the statute, there's a list of like what can the court consider in determining what's equitable, and we couldn't fit it in. We couldn't fit that list of things that the court could consider in the time that we have today, because it is literally anything, and almost no two judges are going to look at. They may get to hear from each spouse for 4 hours during a one-day trial, and make a decision as to like what each spouse's contributions were during a 20 or 30-year relationship. You know, Here's like the other kind of secret is these judges don't want to be doing it either. They
Mm-mm.
don't. We have friends that are judges, and they're not excited about trying your divorce case either. They have a very limited amount of time to make the most monumental decisions for your life, your kids, your custody, your money, and their hands are tied in terms of how much time they can spend getting that information from you. And so it is not, I describe it to my clients as, they're not going to come in with a scalpel and like, they come in with a hatchet,
They
because
try to get it done.
they got to get it done, and they don't have the time to get super granular and hear about everything that happened over a long marriage. And most judges will tell you you're in a better position to make this decision than I am. They want you to settle the case. They want you to make these agreements ahead of time to save them the trouble of having imperfect information and having to make these huge decisions. So yeah, I mean, you can leave it up to a court to decide what is fair, and that judge may not share your values, or you and your spouse can make the decision about what's fair up front. And I believe that you are much better to decide in your relationship what the rules are than a judge who really doesn't get to know you that much.
Right. And I will say, I haven't had any, I've never been in any kind of family law case. I had one way long time ago, but I haven't done much of it. And I had a hearing scheduled, a Zoom hearing, and it was related to work I do with real estate. And I had to sit through a divorce hearing before I could get to mine. It was like the most painful thing. I had to hear about infidelity. I had to hear about Zelle money sent to the girlfriend. I had to hear about picking kids up from school, all this stuff. And you could tell the judge was just like, "Can y'all please get through this?" And all that talking, all that, just everything. At the end of it, the judge is like, "All right, so boom, 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 boom." I mean, it's just like it's not worth it to have to go through all that if you can avoid it. And I do also want to just bring it back and say we are not talking about planning for a divorce. This is not what this conversation is about. Divorce is a real possibility that is part of the prenup conversation. But I also wanted to point out that marriages end in other ways. A marriage can end when one spouse dies. And so does a prenup impact that scenario where perhaps, so the situations I get with my clients, one would be, this is my family property. I inherited my great grandfather's land and I love my spouse so much, but I don't want my spouse to have an interest in my great granddaddy's land if I pass away. Because then they might remarry and then their new spouse ends up getting this family land as well. I wanted to go to my children, or I wanted to go to, if we don't have children, to a niece or a nephew who's still in that bloodline. So that's one situation I can imagine for my heirs property families. You've inherited property from your family that you want to stay in your bloodline. Then the other scenario I think about is someone who perhaps was married before and their spouse passed away and they acquired assets with that spouse. They want that to stay with their children. They love their new spouse, but they don't want them to get everything that they earned with their previous spouse. They want that to go to their children. So those are some scenarios that I've talked with my clients about that, they're not thinking about marriage ending in divorce. They're even just thinking when one of us dies, how do I make sure that my separate property goes to the people that I want it to go to? So could you talk a little bit about how prenups intersect with when a spouse dies?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think, the way that I describe it, because I think the same way that sometimes people come to you with issues that can sometimes, at least a piece of the issue can be addressed with a prenup. A lot of times people come to me with an issue where some of what needs to be addressed is, addressing it in a will or a trust. And so the way that I describe it to my clients is, you and your spouse have all of these collections of assets. The prenup is going to determine what is in your bucket, what's in your spouse's bucket, and what's in the joint bucket. And then the estate planning says what happens to what's in your bucket and your 50% share of the hours bucket, right? And then your spouse gets their estate planning documents and decides what happens to whatever is in the yours bucket and one half of the hours bucket on their end. And I try to make it to where I never want to be in a situation where my prenup uh, says something different than what somebody's will or estate planning documents say. And so, we can certainly put, the inheritance that you have, we can write it into the agreement that that stays with you. If there is a divorce or if there is a death, that then the court looks at your will to find out what happens to the inheritance or your family business or your family property. But the reason that it's so important to get both a prenup and to get an estate plan done is because if you are married and you've got like that family property, um, that is considered your separate property under the law. Whatever you bring into your marriage is considered your separate property. However, separate property can get converted, often accidentally, into marital property. And there's a bunch of ways that can happen. The law basically says that anything that is gained during the marriage due to the efforts of the parties during the marriage is considered marital property. And so you can have a piece of property that is just your separate property, but as soon as you start taking your earnings during the marriage, which remember that's marital income, and you're paying the mortgage on that family property, or you're taking money that you earned during the marriage and you're investing it into that family business. Um, Now there's a piece of that business or a piece of that family property that can be considered marital property. And then if that couple gets divorced, it's up to a judge to decide how much. I've even had properties where there's not the property is paid off 100%, but a spouse is going over there and they're making repairs to the property or they're painting the property. Well, now have you improved the value of that property due to the efforts made during the marriage? There's an argument that you have. And so it's very easy for a spouse who is trying to maximize their takeaway from a divorce case to go and say, oh, yeah, I know you own that prior to marriage, but you increased the value of it during the marriage. And part of that increase is what is up for division. Or you invested money you earned during the marriage into that family business, that family property, and some of that needs to come back and get divided. And the way that you take that off the table is by saying it's in the prenup. That property that's titled in my name is 100% mine. No matter, even if I put work into it, if I put some dollars into it, that remains 100% mine. And whatever we choose to put in our joint names, that will be the joint property. And that's a much, much cleaner way to have that situation, rather than just kind of like hoping that you don't get divorced or that there's not a fight if you pass away. And even if somebody dies, your spouse's heirs might say, ooh, there's some money here, let me come after a piece of what's there. But if it's defined in the prenup what's on your side of the column and what's on your spouse's side of the column, then it makes for hopefully a much easier process if somebody is going through, if the state is ending up getting divided.
Right, right. And so, even when what you were just explaining, it made me think it's kind of assuming that the both parties had some kind of an estate plan. And we're thinking about, okay, well, what's yours and what's mine with the estate plan. But if you don't have an estate plan and one of the spouses passes away, then that means that the surviving spouse is entitled to at least one third of the assets, maybe half of the assets. depending on how many children there are. And then the rest is split between children from the marriage, outside the marriage. It is not really clear. So we have situations where a spouse owned the house together. And now, when one spouse has died, now the surviving spouse owns this house in conjunction with her stepchildren and with her biological children, and they may not all agree on how this house is supposed to be handled. Or you have a spouse has a right to year support. So that means that they're entitled to ensure that their financial needs are met for a year after their spouse has died. And sometimes that year support can end up attaching to family property or separate property that everybody knew was the deceased spouse's property, but because of this year support claim, now they have priority over that. And so I think that that's another way that a prenup helps, because you are clearly saying this is what controls. I actually didn't do the research before this call, and I don't know if you know the answer in terms of if someone dies without a will, does a year support trump a prenup? I didn't look into that, but do you know the answer to that?
Yeah, so it's yes, it's going to depend on the language in the prenup. And what is our standard to do is basically to say, so when you get married, not only do you get all these kind of rights into what your spouse is earning during the marriage and those kinds of things, but you also get certain rights that automatically come to you if your spouse passes away. And sometimes that can be in conflict with what somebody puts in their will or what they actually wanted to happen. And so it's very common for couples in a prenup to say, we're going to waive any rights that we would get in each other's property that just come by virtue of like state law. So again, you're opting out of like the state defaults and making your own. And people will do that. They'll waive the rights that the state gives them in each other's property so that whatever you put in your will is going to be followed to the letter of the law. And you don't have something where you've left a bunch of things to your children or other people on your side of the family, but then that's in conflict with, like you said, the year's worth of widower's rights, or a third of the assets that you automatically get. And that way, again, you're choosing it intentionally. And you may have a situation where you do want 100% of everything to go to your spouse, or 50% to go to your spouse, or 20%. But at least then you're making that conscious choice of exactly what goes to your spouse versus your stepchildren versus your other family members, rather than that decision being made by the state for you. Yeah, so I think that's a great point of like how does the estate plan and the prenup interact with each other.
Yeah, and then just from the estate planning perspective, a lot of times we will create trust. We'll do a trust where each spouse has, if, especially if they come into the relationship with different assets, we'll have where each spouse has their own trust, but then they're designed to intersect with each other when one of the spouses dies, so that even if this one spouse has things in their trust, income produced from those assets in the trust can be used to benefit the surviving spouse until they're gone, and then everything goes however they have dictated in their estate plans. And so I see a lot of opportunities for how you can really solidify things from a legal standpoint in your marriage by having a good prenup, by having a good estate plan, and making sure those things talk to each other so that you everything flows smoothly. Because I will say that there's a default provision in our trust documents that says if there is a marital agreement, a prenup, a postnup, then that's going to control over whatever's in the estate plan. So it's really important for us to have those work together. And so whenever clients work with our firm, we say, hey, do you have a prenup or a postnup, any kind of marital agreement? Please make sure we see that so that we can account for it in your estate plan. Because if you don't give it to us, then we can't help you. So that's something that we actually have to be mindful of as well when we're doing the estate planning documents, to make sure that we don't draft a whole beautiful document that doesn't even work because there's an outstanding prenup or postnup in there. So I also wanted to, again, because I think prenups are important for just in case the marriage does not succeed, or I won't say succeed, because if the marriage does not continue until death do us part, I'll say that. Because I heard someone say that a marriage can be successful until it's not, and then that's when they ended it. And I thought that was an interesting perspective. So I don't want to say failed marriage. I say a marriage that's ended. Hopefully it'll be successful during the entire time that the marriage exists. But one thing I wanted to do is ask you about enforceability. So I can imagine for sure in the event of a divorce, then there would be this prenup that the more than likely would be enforceable. But what about some of those things we talked about before? Things like having the annual shareholders meeting or things like spending limits. Let's say you're in the marriage and you're like, they're not upholding the contract. We don't want to go to court for that. So what are some of the things that are in place that can be put in place to help a couple to enforce their prenup during their marriage in a way that still promotes harmony in the relationship?
Yeah, yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a great point. I think, you know, if we are being honest as lawyers, there are all kinds of provisions in contracts that we sign all the time that are, you know, at best, um, difficult, you know, to enforce. You know, like the example that I like to give is, you sign a lease, and the lease says if you are late by, you know, 1 day on your lease, you got to pay a $50 late fee. Well, if you don't pay that late fee, um, then, you know, is the other person going to really take you to court over $50? You know, or can you just like let that hanging out there? Well, 99% of the people are going to pay the late fee because it's in writing. It wasn't based on an assumption. It wasn't based on what's fair because it's in writing. And most people are not going to force you to drag them to court to uphold what's in the agreement. So there's a little bit of like self enforcement that happens. And then number two, you know, on that lease, the person is going to make a decision as to whether they want to rent to you for another year. If you're not going to be the kind of person to be honest and uphold the terms of the agreement, they may never take you to court for that money, but it at least allows them to make an informed decision. So take that into the context of, you know, a prenup. You have an agreement that says, all right, we're both going to deposit, you know, 50% of our paychecks into the joint account, or maybe 100% of our paychecks are going to go in the joint account. And one person gets mad and they say, you know what, you pay the bills on your own. I'm depositing my paycheck into my own account. Then now you know you have a crisis. And what I saw in my divorce work is a lot of people, because there was no kind of agreement on what they were going to do financially, they didn't really feel like they had anything to complain about because it wasn't like it was in writing. It wasn't like there was some kind of agreement, you know. And so people would find themselves in this position where, like, I'm upset, but like, who's really to say who's in the wrong? Because it's not like we ever said this is how we're going to do it. But if you have a rule that says every year we're going to sit down and we're going to disclose, you know, what our finances look like, and year one, year two, year three, your spouse does it, and year four, all of a sudden they don't want to show you what their finances look like. Now you have a clear point where I know that like this agreement that we made has now been violated, and you have a decision to make. You know, do you try to work on the relationship? Do you suggest counseling? Do you do you try to end the relationship? But at least you are making an informed decision based on someone not following the agreement. And courts can sometimes come back and, in the context of a divorce, enforce things that weren't done during the relationship itself. So one of the things that's gotten some media attention is Michael Strahan, football player for the Giants. He's now like a TV personality. He went through a divorce, and in his prenup, it said that during the marriage, he was going to give his wife 20% of whatever his earnings were would go to her for her spending money, you know, for her, you know, access to the funds. And he didn't do it during the marriage. Well, when they split up in their divorce, not only did the court uphold their prenup, where she got, you know, a specific amount, 50% of the assets that they had accumulated, but the court also gave her back pay for the 20% of the money that she was supposed to be getting during the marriage itself. So certainly there is some possibility, you know, are you going to, you know, drag your spouse to court if they don't, you know, turn over their tax return, you know, or something, you know, in year one of the marriage? No, maybe not. But, you know, number one, you at least have something written on paper where you can go back and say, hey, this is what we were supposed to do. And number two, you can make an informed decision about the status of your relationship because you put some rules in place. And just like you have kind of, you know, getting married, you have an assumed contract that your spouse is going to be faithful. And if your spouse is unfaithful, then you know you got a decision to make because they broke that contract. Can a court come in and enforce them to be faithful? No. But you can you can make an informed decision now that your spouse has broken the rules about, do we renegotiate this marital contract that we're in? Do we end it? Or, or what do we do? And along those lines, one of the things that I originally put in my own prenup with my wife, and now it is one of the most popular requests that I get for prenups, in the ones that I draft, is provisions about counseling. So we made an agreement. One thing I saw in my divorce work is, one spouse would want to go to counseling. You'd usually be after a fight, and the other spouse, they'd say, I want to go to counseling. The other spouse would feel like they were being accused of like having something wrong with them. And they'd be like, no, I'm not going to counseling. You go by yourself. And then by the time spouse two came around to the idea of counseling, number one had given up on the counseling, or maybe they'd given up on the relationship altogether. And so my wife and I, we agreed, if either of us wants to go to counseling, we put a provision in our prenup. Either of us can trigger this provision once per year, and we got to go to 3 counseling sessions. And if divorce is actually on the table, then we got to do 6 before either spouse can file for divorce. And I've seen courts kick a divorce complaint out and say, you haven't done your counseling yet. You haven't done your mediation. You have a mediation clause. If we're going to get divorced, we got to do mediation first and see if we can resolve everything before we go and start spending money on lawyers. And just having that in, so that like we know ahead of time, it's not punitive. Either of us have the ability to trigger this counseling during the marriage. Now we go to counseling when our relationship dips from like, a 9 out of 10 to a 7 out of 10. We can go and try to get back to that 9 rather than wait until our relationship's at a 2, and now the marriage is basically over. Now we have kind of like this internal permission to go and get a tune-up and to do these things during the marriage itself, rather than wait until our relationship is on at death's door. And so, is a court going to drag my spouse to counseling? No, but I think it is still very helpful to have a framework in place for what are our expectations in this relationship.
Yeah, I love that last point. I've been really enjoyed this whole conversation, but I think that last point is just a really great place to end, because I think, as I've kind of said throughout, like I want people to see prenups not as, well, we're planning for if we get divorced, but we're trying to put things in place to make a firm foundation for our relationship. And I just realized that so many things are not talked about. What if one spouse wants to go to counseling and the other doesn't? They have nothing to make it happen, and it could be the best thing that that couple could ever have done, but they have nothing to back them up. And so I just think that having that kind of provision in a prenup is just saying, hey, we neither one of us is, one, going to give up on this marriage before we really try, and two, we're going to have some things in place to ensure that we can do what we can before it gets to be too late. And I think that's a really great approach to entering a marriage relationship, a marriage contract commitment. So I'm gonna end our conversation here, but I did want to give you a chance to share how people can get in touch with you, also how they can get your book. Because again, like I have enjoyed the book. I think it's funny, it's fun. I've learned some things just about marriage in general. It's a great conversation topic for your spouse, for your friends. So check it out, the prenup prescription, and I'm going to let you share how people can learn more about you and stay in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and thank you so much for this opportunity to speak, and for helping me get the message out there with the book. The Prenup Prescription is available on Amazon, and all other kind of online booksellers, wherever books are sold. You can find out more about me, our business, our approach at prenups.com. And you can follow us we're on all the social media networks. I'm Prenup Guy, on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, all those places, LinkedIn. But we have links out to the book, to all of our resources. We have a free ebook, 7 Steps to a Marriage Saving Prenup, on the website itself. Come check us out, prenups.com.
Awesome. And I want to thank everybody who participated. I'm seeing the comments in the chat, and I just really appreciate everyone's participation. I'm hoping that we addressed your questions and comments. I was mindful of them when I asked my own questions, but thank you so much for taking time in the middle of the day to join us. And everyone have a wonderful day. And we're going to put this on YouTube so that you can look at it later and share it with all your friends. And yeah, have a wonderful afternoon and take care. Thank you, Erin.